Hey everybody, it's Paxton from Holy Family. I want to take a time today to put a little video series together. Father Jeff reached out to me earlier this past weekend with us having to kind of readjust and schedule our opportunities for worship together along with our men's group. We've been meeting weekly in the past to study Max Lucado's book, Anxious for Nothing, Finding Calm in a Chaotic World. So we're going to take a little bit of a time to try to work on a video series. I've really done this a lot as far as working with video and editing. So we're going to kind of do some test runs, kind of see how things work and just go from there. But I think it's going to be a good opportunity for myself and for you as a church family and whoever you might be able to share this with friends and family, neighbors who have the ability to watch online, to just spend some time with each other, even though we're having to be socially distant and aware and mindful while the coronavirus, COVID-19, is impacting not only our globe and our world, but now our country and state and even local counties. So it's going to be a good opportunity, I think, to do that, just to spend some time working through this book series, giving you some inspiration there, getting into God's Word, and just kind of seeing where we can go and how that can impact and affect our lives for the better right now, with how uncertain and crazy the world is. So with that in mind, the book series that we've been doing by Max Lucado focuses on the book of Philippians. It's Paul's letter to the book of to Church of Philippi when he was imprisoned. So he was going through some really crazy, tough times back then, being tortured, being on his own, alone, not really knowing if he was going to be able to, get free. But in all of that, he didn't have any anxiety. He gave it all up, turned everything over to God, and was just there to do the best he could in the circumstances that he had, and to get through that, and to totally depend on God for comfort and support, and whatever he faced, that it was not going to be enough to overpower him, overcome him, and make him too anxious and stressful in those situations. So this week, we're going to kind of jump into a few chapters ahead. I'm planning to send information out with Father Jeff that'll actually have an outline of the book, which is widely available by purchase, hard copy through Amazon. If you're an audiobook person, it is also available in audiobook. And there's also formats available for ebook. So if you like reading on a digital format, it's also available that way. We're going to jump into chapter 5. It's a very fitting chapter, I think, with what is going on with the impact of this virus, crisis, health concerns in the globe right now, of how it's a contagious calm we should be having right now. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world. We're not really sure how long this is going to go on. Only God knows that. But in these moments when there's so much uncertainty, anxiety, and stress, and how it's impacting our work lives, our personal lives, those of friends and family, and ones that we love and care for, it's good just to understand that God is always around. He's always there with us. So there's times that we can, feel overwhelmed. We're ready just to throw in the towel. The stress and anxiety kind of just push us to our breaking point. But in that, we can always turn to God and understand and know that He is there with us, regardless of the situation and how desperate and desire it might be and feel to us as human beings. God, our Creator, is always there to see us through with it. And He has an ultimate solution in all this. It might be tough for us to see what that is and what that ultimate purpose is. And in time, I think we can start to see what positives might come from this. I know there's a lot of negatives with people on the front lines battling this daily. Our global and nation's leaders, our healthcare providers, our doctors, nurses, first responders, police, fire department, all of them are putting their lives at risk daily to help combat and confront this virus, that we can hopefully kind of get through it. And I applaud y'all. I thank y'all. I pray for y'all daily for what y'all are doing. So that's kind of a good thing there. But through all that, it can be tough. We're having to kind of socially be distant. If we have families, if we're alone, we're single, or if we have family who don't live nearby, who have health issues, or friends or family who have health issues of friends, we have to always be mindful of that right now, to where we're not trying to put ourselves in situations to make this situation much more severe. So hopefully it can begin to peak and work through it. And I think it's just going to be a good series too, with life in general. There's a lot of uncertainty, anxiety, and stressful moments we'll face in life, aside from the coronavirus issue right now that's really heavily impacting us. So it'd be a good resource to kind of dig in and take time. Whether you want to follow along and read through the book yourself, or just kind of tune in and watch this video series as we work through that, I think it'll be a good thing to do that, to kind of just take some time out. We all have busy schedules. Our schedules, I would imagine right now, are heavily impacted. I know personally, my work schedule, we're considered a non-essential business. So right now, we really don't have a lot of work to do. And being non-essential, it's best for us to really not be in at work, to stay home, stay safe the best we can to help kind of mitigate the situation. So with that, we'll kind of jump in. This chapter 5 this week, is titled Contagious Calm. So I thought that was really fitting with what's going on in the world. And the subtitle is Anxiety is Needless Because God is Always Near. So we'll kind of jump into that. There's also a section in the book, and I'll kind of highlight a few of those key points towards the end of this series today, that Max asks a lot of questions and a lot of time to kind of be introspective of how you see things and how you can learn from this chapter, and how you can ask yourself some questions, dig deeper into God's Word to kind of see what the bigger picture is and what is things we can come from this and take out of it. So we'll jump back to starting off with the first part of the chapter in 1962. So it's been a few years ago. It's 38, I guess, and then we're 2020, so nearly almost 60 years ago, 56 years ago, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that was before my time, I say with respect, but I know a lot of y'all out there might have kind of gone through that, or had parents or grandparents who were here and around who actually witnessed that firsthand. And that was a very dire and stressful and anxious situation, with the Soviets coming towards Cuba and planning to store and prepare to launch nuclear missiles on the U.S. It could have potentially been the start of World War III. And in that, though, there was a 36-year-old chief of staff for the Russian Navy who pretty much stepped up to the plate and was able to prevent that. And for the longest time, his service and what he did was not known. He was never actually acknowledged or rewarded for what he did and said to help prevent that situation, to de-escalate it from becoming a potential nuclear war. But it's kind of remarkable going back into the book and seeing that. So his name, and I apologize if I mispronunciate this with his Russian naming, but it's Vasily Arkhipov, I believe, is how I'm going to pronounce it. Hopefully that's close to being right. No disrespect there. So again, this is in 1962. It's kind of the coming end of the Cold War. He was a chief of staff on the nuclear subs. And so it was basically getting to the point there, to kind of jump into the first part of the chapter. They were coming towards Cuba, and that's kind of their plan, was to store missiles, to have easy access if they needed to do so, to launch and fire those towards the U.S. From the country of Cuba. So within that time frame, they were going through some stress and anxiety themselves. Hurricane Daisy was impacting. So these subs, being they're from Russia, they're kind of more minded for colder waters, winter, colder nature. And then they were in the bruts of tropical waters. So, and then a huge hurricane was going on at the time. 50-foot waves, it says, were leaving them nauseated. It was destroying and wrecking their operational systems. So they were having a lot of issues with navigation, getting to where they were being called to go. And then along with the statement of warm waters, the temperatures on the subship were getting to like the 120s. So it's the issues of being in closed quarters, claustrophobia, and then just being really hot. And this was not like a 2 or 3 day window. This was like 3 weeks of coming from Russia, the Soviet Union, across the globe into Cuban kind of territory area. So this was not something that just happened overnight. This took a lot of time, and being, in close quarters for that period of time, hot in close quarters, we should say, it can make them very exhausted, making their temperament and nature on edge and very anxious in that. And so the situation was kind of building, kept escalating. They received orders from Moscow to turn northward and start to patrol the coast of Florida. And once they'd entered American waters, that's when our radar kind of picked up. And they sent out ships and aircraft to kind of confront and kind of have our defenses there in case things became too severe and it became a potential World War situation. The U.S. ships, they set off death charges to kind of make them aware. It's like, hey, we're understanding what you're doing here. You'll need to kind of pause before this kind of gets too bad. And the Russians, by sheer result of that, felt they were under attack. So the captain was ready to hit the button. Really lost his cool. But in that moment, Vasily kind of stepped up and asked for a moment of his captain's time to let him kind of speak with them and just kind of get some concerns he had to say, hey, maybe we just need to hit the pause button here and not quite jump to this type of reaction. Because understanding, once we do hit those launch buttons, we understand what is going to be the result of that. So we kind of took a moment to kind of talk to him. He urged him to kind of reconsider what his plan was. And in that, the captain listened to him. He actually took advice of his chief of staff, a lesser person in command. Those of you with military experience understand that. His anger calmed down. His head kind of became more level-headed. And so the vessels kind of surfaced. So in that, we were able to avoid that kind of crisis and not get into the situation of potential World War III back in the 1960s. So as we said earlier, he was not really acknowledged for doing that. We actually didn't even know all this took place until 2002. So basically 40 years had to transpire before this information ever got out to us. So why does that story matter if we take a minute to kind of pause and reflect with our present situation being here in 2020? So we're not going to be on a sub-ship for 3 weeks at a time, but you might be in school having a very high course load. You might be facing the headwinds of recession. I know right now that's a huge concern with the impact of coronavirus and how that is going to impact our economy, both globally, our nation, our state, even our local counties. That's kind of a big concern right now, with people potentially losing their sources of income. Unemployment rates are projected to kind of hit into the 30%, what stats I've seen through the news. So that's a huge concern right now that we're facing as a nation, as a country, and globally in that. It might even be the situation of your, having to be at the hospital with a sick loved one, a child, a dying parent, aunt, uncle. Right now with the health concerns, there are people who are fighting for their lives. Nurses and doctors have been impacted. They're fighting for their lives, putting themselves on the front lines with that. And I know a lot of people at Holy Family are first responders, or they'll work through the police and fire and emergency services. And so they're seeing that firsthand, day to day, week to week, with this going on. So that's kind of a huge concern to face with every day, that you're going in and you pray and you hope and you turn over to God that you're going to make it through that day and that He's there for you. So it's a really tough challenge in that. Within that, going back to the kind of economic issues, business owners, small business owners, I work for a small business. So there's kind of the concerns and impacts there. Are we going to be able to kind of turn things around once this kind of does resolve itself? Stay afloat. Schools, I know a lot of schools right now are having to cancel, close K-12 systems. Colleges are turning to like online courses, shutting down their campuses, sending students home. So there's a lot of concerns there. The point of businesses or schools are a business. They're meant there for education, but they're also a business. They're based on being income-wise from students paying tuition and receiving grant money, both state and federally. So that's kind of impacting them to get through these times. So in these moments, we can be really quick to react. A hair trigger, having a tough days like this, tough weeks, months, most definitely I think is kind of on our present radar. We can be quick to react and kind of fly off the handle and want to hit the easy trigger button just to get past this, to move on, to get back to our old normal. They've been kind of floating the idea out now of the new normal. So that's kind of been the new thing of, with all this going on, are we going to be able to find a job if we've lost our job, go back to work, and when will work increase? Can we find food and provisions that we need at the grocery stores? I know that's been a huge concern right now. You go to the grocery stores, toilet paper, sanitizing products, meat, and just general provisions that we're thankful for to have in a normal world are a lot tougher to come by right now. So that's kind of a huge concern. And in all of that, we were kind of quick to jump on the option just to fly off the handle and just go immediately kind of into overdrive and not take a moment to kind of pause and have calm and peace and look to God, who's always there with us to get those answers. So this chapter or book especially is built upon the book of Philippians. So Paul was writing a letter to the church at Philippi while he's imprisoned to kind of encourage them to fight through the struggles they're facing for as a new church. And in the moments and all that he's been through, tortured, beaten, left in shackles and chains in prison, that he is not anxious, he is not stressful in those moments. He's just there and he's giving everything to God. So kind of a key phrase and word that we can build upon for this in this chapter, it's a Greek word, it's translated of gentleness as epikes. That's E-P-I-E-K-E-S. And that can be translated as a temperament that is seasoned and mature. It envisions an attitude that is fitting to the occasion, level-headed and tempered. Gentle reaction is one of steadiness, even-handedness, fairness. It looks humanly and reasonably at the facts of a case. And the opposite of that, we could see it as being overreaction or a sense of panic. So it's kind of like a day and night, black and white kind of way of seeing things, by having gentleness in those kind of moments. And when you are that way, when life is really stressful, moments have you down, it becomes evident to all. Your coworkers, your friends, your family, they pick up on that. And they know they can depend and go to you, that in those moments, you're not going to be the one to kind of fly off the handle and get overwhelmed and overstressed in those moments. And that in turn can, impact them. It makes your home life, your work life, your life if you're a public leader, that much better. That, you're not the one that's going to be the one so quick to react. The contagiously calm person is the one who reminds others that God is in control. So in those moments, we don't try to control and fix things and take control of that. We'll see that here a little bit later on, the story of Jesus and the disciples and the feeding of the 5,000. It's just understanding that God is there. He understands what the situation is. He knows what the outcome is, and how we're going to get there. And the time frame to getting there might seem really crazy for us, especially with our current situation. But God knows what that time frame is, and He knows that we're going to get through this. And it won't be easy. It's going to be very difficult. People have lost their lives through this, and many more, unfortunately, will have the potential of losing their lives, losing loved ones, or becoming just very sick and having to fight and depend on doctors and nurses to get through that if they have to end up going to the hospital during all this. So the big question is, A contagiously calm person, big idea here, is one who reminds others that God's in control. It's the executive who tells the company, let's do our part, we'll be okay. It's the leader who sees the challenge, acknowledges it, and observes, these are tough times, but we're going to get through them. I know a lot of press conferences have been happening, both on a national level, a local level, with the Davidson County Mayor speaking out, and then as a state level with Governor Lee speaking out, that we've kind of depended on them to share the information. And in that, we're taking time to not, try to misinterpret the information they're sharing, and not have it kind of be overwhelming, but just have a resource to get the right information, or know where we can go to and what resources we can tap into to get proper information during this time so we can best address those concerns. So the big question of gentleness is, where do we get that? How can you and I keep our hands away from the trigger? How can we keep our heads when everyone else is losing theirs? So the big key thing here is in the book of Philippians. It's chapter 4, verses 5 through 6. It's, let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything. So God is always here. We might feel alone in these times if we're physically alone, or if we have become sick and we have to be alone from others, those that, friends and family we love, to keep from spreading this virus. But in that, we're not alone. God's there. There's never a moment and when you face life without help. God's always with us. And we can see that by kind of going back and examining some sections from Genesis, from the Old Testament, of how God's always there, present with us. To Abram, he said, do not be afraid. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward. To Hagar, the angel announced, do not be afraid. God has heard. When Isaac was expelled from his land by the Philistines and forced to move from place to place, God appeared to him and reminded him, do not be afraid, for I am with you. And after Moses' death, God told Joshua, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. God's with David whenever he was still kind of coming out of and making the decision to commit adultery. He was with Jacob in spite of his conniving. He was with Elijah in spite of his lack of faith. And in the ultimate declaration of communion, of God always being there with us, he called himself Emmanuel, which means God is with us. He became flesh through Jesus. He took on the sin of the world. He defeated the grave. He rose again from death. And in the form of his Holy Spirit, he's always with us to comfort, teach, and convict us until it's our time to go home and be with him in eternity. So in this, we shouldn't really jump to the conclusion or the attitude mindset that God is watching from a distance. He's not a spectator in the crowd. He's not like a parent in the stands watching a son or daughter play a soccer or baseball game. He's right there with us on the field, at the plate, as we face these life's challenges. And it might, in those moments when we face this as just human beings, that we think, hey, we're alone, question, what is the purpose of all this? Is God really there to be with us? Does he actually have his hand controlling the situation? And he does. In those moments of being isolated, it creates kind of a downward cycle of fret. So we start to worry and make bigger problems into bigger problems. Smaller problems become mountains, that we feel like we just can't get past. Instead, we should choose to be the person who clutches to the presence of God with both hands. It's kind of some good advice that Max writes there in this chapter. And he kind of draws that from Psalms 118:6. The Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? So because the Lord is near, we should be anxious for nothing. That's Paul's kind of key point in the book of Philippians in his letters. And it's kind of key to remember that he's writing a letter. The chapters and verses weren't added till later in the 13th and 16th centuries that Max writes. So that structure helps us to kind of break down the book of Philippians, but it also can be a slight hindrance to understand how Paul was meaning to organize and actually write these letters. He actually intended the words of verse 5 and 6 to read in one fell swoop. The Lord is near, consequently, do not be anxious about anything. And early commentators on the Bible saw this, and they like to phrase sometimes things this way: the Lord is at hand, have no anxiety. Or Theodoret of Cyrus translated the words, the Lord is near, have no worries. So we can take our concerns to God because he is there with us the whole entire time. There's nothing we can face and be confronted with that we can't turn to him and give over to him and have him kind of show us in his time, in his way, what the solution remedies will be to get through those situations. So we kind of segue here. It's a really good example from the four Gospels of the disciples and Jesus having to feed the 5,000. I know right now, if that was going on, if the disciples were here, Jesus was here, and we were being called to feed the 5,000, the disciples, as we'll see here in a few minutes, might be quick to kind of jump to say, social distance. This is not the time for that. But in that, in a kind of more serious tone, they were really anxious and stressed out in these moments when they were kind of seeing people come to them. And it wasn't like 5 people. It wasn't 10. It wasn't even 500. It was 5,000 needing to be fed. I know a lot of times if you have dinner guests come over, if it might be kind of last minute or like kind of a surprise visit, you might be kind of quick to panic. You know, I've got 5 people coming over. What am I going to do for food and entertainment? This was 5,000 people that needed to be nourished and have food. And the big question issue was, were they going to have enough to feed this number of people? So these stories from the Bible, they kind of originate, again, from the 4 Gospels. And in that, they are, in all 4 Gospels, they're kind of recollected and told. So in Matthew, it's chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. And then it's also collected in Mark, chapter 6, 30 through 44. In Luke, it's in chapter 9, verses 10 through 17. And then in the book of John, it's chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. So all 4 Gospels give the varying accounts of this miracle that Jesus performed to feed the 5,000. So I encourage you, as part of this week's video series, to take some time to go back and kind of read those chapters and verses and kind of comparison to kind of see how every one was kind of able to relate and tell that story and see how not only how Jesus saw it and was able to resolve the situation, but how the disciples saw it, which we're going to dig into a little bit here. So the big thing was the disciples were really kind of concerned about how they're going to handle the situation. And Jesus basically told them, he's like, we're going to do it. It might seem impossible, but there's going to be a solution to this. We're going to figure it out. So he lifted up his eyes, this is Jesus, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But he said it as a test. So he already knew the answer to this question before he even asked it to him. He said it to him as a test, for he said himself knew that what he would do. So he kind of already knew the solution. That's in John chapter 6, 5 and 6. When John described this gathering as a great multitude, he was serious. There were 5,000 men, plus women and children, which is kind of noted in Matthew chapter 14. So imagine a crowd at like a sports arena, and you'll kind of get a better picture of how many people were ready to eat and needing food. And Jesus was ready to feed every single one of them. And as we'll see shortly, there was a lot more left over and how it worked out. The disciples, on the other hand, they wanted to basically tell everybody to just go away. Go into the villages, buy their own food, source their own means of nourishment. And there's probably some anxiety in those words. Aggravation, frustration. They weren't going to Jesus, calling him master, asking him for recommendations on how he was planning to do or what they could do in service of him to help figure out this problem. They instead actually went to Jesus and tried to tell him what to do. which is kind of crazy and ironic that they would be able to willing to go to the Son of God and say, "Hey, Jesus, this is what we should do here." They saw a valley of hungry people. So in this, it's kind of, I guess, a question to say, were they justified in that? And as a human being, I think when we face those kind of situations, it can be quick for us to, or easy per se, and quick for us to kind of jump in and say, "Hey, we'll take care of this. We've got this under control. We'll figure this out. Here's the easiest solution to what we're going to do here, and that's going to let this problem kind of just clear out and move on." And in that, we were very hesitant and reluctant to seek God's wisdom in this. And in the same way, the disciples were the same way. They heard growling stomachs, which would in turn become scowling faces, and they might have a riot on their hands. They have 5,000 people. There's Jesus and the 12 disciples. So within that, they're very kind of worried and weary and anxious and stressful and how the situation is going to work out in itself. So they had justified reasons to be unsettled. But at the same time, they should have equal reason to be at peace because Jesus is right there with them. Between me and the camera right now, God was right there, and he fully knew how this was going to work out in the long run. And at this point in time, they had seen Jesus complete quite a number of miracles. So he had healed a man with leprosy. That's in Matthew chapter 8. He had healed the centurion's servant without going to the servant's bedside. That's also in Matthew chapter 8. He had healed Peter's mother-in-law, Matthew chapter 8. He had calmed the violent sea, also Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 9, he heals a paralytic. He heals a woman who had been sick for 12 years, also in Matthew chapter 9. He had raised a girl from the dead in Matthew 9. He had driven out a evil spirit in Mark, the first chapter, verse 25. He had healed a demon-possessed man in a cemetery in Mark chapter 5:15. He had turned water into wine in John 2:9. And that he had healed a man who had been an invalid for 38 years in John chapter 5. So they had seen all these miracles performed, and in that they should have had no doubt, no worry that God would have things under control, that Jesus was on the ball. He knew what the solution was and how it was going to work out in the long run, but they still were very doubtful and tried to kind of take control and take things over. And in that, and not giving that control and concern up to God, up to Jesus, they became very stressful and anxious in those moments. They didn't have the time to kind of really step back and think, "Hey, Jesus healed these sick people. He raised this girl from the dead. He calmed the angry waves. Maybe he has a solution to all this that we just can't quite see just yet. So maybe we should go to him and kind of see what he has in mind." He's right there. We could just ask him. It's not like he's cities or towns away. You could literally just walk over to him and kind of say, "Jesus, what is your solution in this? What can we do to help you and serve you to be able to kind of feed these 5,000 people who need to be fed?" But instead they didn't do that. They act like he wasn't even there. Instead of counting on Christ, they had the audacity to tell the creator of the world that nothing could be done because there wasn't enough money to provide enough food to feed the 5,000. So how did Jesus maintain his composure? How did he keep from looking at the disciples and saying, "Have you forgotten who I am?" So in that moment, a young boy offered his lunch basket to Andrew, who tentatively mentioned the offer to Jesus. And this comes from John 6, starting in verse 10. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass. In that place they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat. So it wasn't just, "Hey, here's a small little piece of fish, a small little loaf of bread, a little piece of a snack, what have you." They were having a full meal out of this. And he said to the disciples, "Gather the pieces that were left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the fish and the 5 barley loaves that were left over after they had eaten. They didn't spend one penny. 1 coin was spent. They started the day with 200 coins. They ended the day with the same 200 coins. In addition, they left and filled over, like we said, the 12 baskets with food, which is kind of the irony there, the coincidence. The great thing about it is 12 disciples, and they had 12 baskets of food left over. The people were fed, so the problem was resolved. The bank account was fine. The money was still there. They had to spend 1 penny to resolve the issue. And in that, they were able to learn that anxiety is needless because Jesus is always near. So looking back at that kind of miracle, how that can correlate with us here in the present time, we're not having to feed the 5,000 per se. There's definitely issues with people needing to be nourished in these times, and when the world is working as best as it can, there are people all around the world fighting with issues with hunger and nourishment. But in a bigger sense, bigger picture, we can kind of take and how we can adapt this to our lives, and especially in the situation we're facing right now. You might be facing a tight deadline at your job in 2 days. There's a loved one who's really sick and needs a cure right now, especially with that going on. There might be a child you have who's being bullied at school. A spouse is intertwined in temptation. So on one hand, you have these problems you're trying to work through and understand how you're going to resolve and address those. And on the other hand, we have a very small, finite amount of wisdom, energy, patience, or time. And if you really kind of boil it down and kind of break it down, we don't have near the amount of wisdom, energy, patience, and time to address those, if we're being completely honest. You have a thimble full, and you need bucket loads, is a good way that Max writes there to kind of compare it. And so we're immediately going to become anxious, stressed out. Instead of going to God to say, hey, what is your wisdom, your guidance in this, to find the answers, our quick reaction is to say, take it away. I don't want to deal with it. It's not a good time right now. I don't have the patience and understanding to deal with this. But instead of that, when we face those moments, a better mindset would be, instead of starting with what you do have, start with Jesus. Start with His wealth, His resources, and His strength. And before you open the ledger, open your heart. Before you count coins or count heads, count the number of times Jesus has helped you and face the impossible. Before you lash out in fear, look up in faith. Take a moment, turn to your Father for help. The end of this chapter kind of wraps up really well with a great kind of story from Bill Frey's book, The Dance of Hope. And it kind of recollects a story of him being 11, living in Georgia. He was doing some chores around the house, gathering firewood for their stove and fireplace in the house. He was searching for tree stumps of pine trees that could be cut down, and he could make them into kindling for the fireplaces. And the best ones were saturated with resin and therefore could burn more easily. So an excerpt from this book says, one day I found a very large stump in an open field near the house and tried to unearth it. I literally pushed and pulled and crowbarred for hours, but the root system was so deep and large I simply couldn't pull it out of the ground. I was still struggling when my father came home from the office. He spotted him working and came over to watch. His father kind of turns to him and says, I think I see your problem. And then Bill, his son, says, well, what's that? His father returns back to him and says, you're not using all your strength. He immediately exploded in reply, in terms of how hard he'd been working, for how long. His father just turned to him simply and said, no, you're not using all your strength. And so Bill took a moment to kind of cool down and kind of collect his thoughts. And he turned to him and said, what did you mean? He says, you haven't asked me to help you. So a good corollary in that, when we're facing these moments, these tough situations, how quick are we trying to take control of the situation ourselves, to resolve it, to make it go away, make it seem less impactful, to seek resolution on our own versus going to God, going to Jesus, and seeking His wisdom and guidance and peace and how He wants to help us get to that situation. So I thought that was a great way to kind of wrap up the chapter. And Max kind of ends it with this statement. The business of anxiety management is like pulling stumps out of the ground. Some of your worries have deep-rooted systems. Extracting them is hard work. In fact, it may be the toughest challenge of all, but you don't have to do it alone. Present the challenge to your Father and ask for help. Will He solve the issue? Yes, He will. Will He solve it immediately? Maybe. Or maybe the rest, part of the test is an advanced course in patience. So it might not be something that's resolved in a few minutes, a few hours, a few days, weeks, months. It could take years, depending on the situation, to kind of have resolution come through. And that's all God's timetable. But the key point there is to not try to figure it out ourselves, to turn it over to God. The key point here, wrapping up the last sentence from the chapter, is a contagious calm will happen to the degree that we turn to Him. So we can have this calm that we can spread, contagious. It's a good contagious calm to have in this case, when we choose to turn things over to God and not let those crazy moments, these uncertain moments we're facing in our world right now, overwhelm us, and understand that God is always there. The back of the book, and this should be present, I'm pretty sure, hopefully, in the ebook formats and the audiobook formats. And I'll kind of recap here. He kind of has some questions and answers to kind of work through, which is really cool once you read the chapters. And the first section is about confronting the chaos. And then there's also a follow-up section about choosing calm and then having time for meditation to kind of pray and think how to kind of apply this chapter specifically right now, in the situation that we're in and in our lives. So I encourage you to kind of work through that. If you kind of take time to actually jump into the book and read the chapter, kind of some highlights of the questions from Confront the Chaos is how to react in stressful and anxious moments. Do we actually know people who are characterized by calm? And then anxiety and effect of being alone, and how that can kind of grow worse when we feel like we're alone, and we kind of fail to remember that God's always there. And following up with that, choosing to be calm, to seek calmness, that how we can find friendship with the Lord. And that's from Psalms 25. So I encourage you to kind of go back and take a moment to read that. And the ways God knows us from the full chapter of Psalm 139. And this is the definition of calm, and that's in Psalm 112, verses 6 through 8. I'm going to be providing a lot of these biblical references, resources to Father Jeff to pass along with this video, so we'll be able to kind of easily jump into God's Word and get those. And again, a lot of them are noted as I've kind of read them through the chapter themselves in hard copy, so they'll be there as well. I want to thank y'all for taking some time out of your schedule. I know right now our schedules and routines are really kind of thrown out of whack, out of their normal day-to-day operation that we've been used to. But when you take time to jump into this, to watch this, or share it with a family, with the loved ones, with friends, and just take some time, whether it's the start of your day, the end of your day, or maybe it's kind of part of your weekend plans, routine, to sit down and maybe watch this video series and jump into this book. It's going to be good to kind of do that, to take time to say, hey, let's pause with what's going on with the world right now, and let's just spend some time with God to see how He's there for us in the situation and how we're going to get through with it. So we'll wrap up today with a good closing prayer, and then we'll kind of move on from there. We'll see. The plan, I think, right now is to kind of have these videos maybe go every week and a half, while the situation's kind of working through. And when we're getting back to normal, we'll definitely kind of be picking up with our men's group at Holy Family. But I encourage you, even if you don't participate in that, and would like to kind of keep up with the book series, I'm more than happy to send that information out to you, provide links to buy a copy, hard copy or digital, other format to pick up, to be able to kind of read and work through. And that I think we can learn a lot with what's going on with the world, and just in general. When we have those anxious, stressful times in our lives, the best ways to manage and find resolution in that by giving things over to God. So we'll start with a good prayer, and we'll wrap up this video series for today. I thank y'all for your time. Like I said, everybody's probably really busy right now, trying the best to kind of just maintain some form of sanity in the chaos. But it's good to kind of just take time and seek God and all that. Our Heavenly Father, I just want to thank y'all. Thank you for allowing us this time right now to use this technology to document and record this video, to be able to share it, not only with our men's group, who are kind of all remote now, but with a church family, and that no matter what situation we face, whether it's concerns of an economic issue right now with the coronavirus, health concerns of friends and family and loved ones who might be impacted by that, and then just the concerns of how this is going to impact our globe and how we're going to be able to recover and go forward from this. But even bigger picture in life in general, when we have those moments where we're not sure how to face those challenges and how to kind of work through them, that we take time to kind of just pause and wait and turn things over to you, and to know that you're always there with us. You're always going to be able to see us through the other side. You know the resolution and how things will work out. You know the end of the chapter before it's even begun to take place in our lives, which is a great thing to know, that as bad as the situation is, as stressed out as we might be in these moments, then the ultimate purpose, you're going to work through this, Lord. I just want to pray for all of our countries and global leaders, our local leaders, our first responders, our police, fire department, the nurses and excuse me, and doctors through that. And that we are just able to thank them, Lord, for all their hard work and commitment, for putting their lives on the line, for all those who are working in essential businesses right now who have to stay open to kind of keep the world going. People who are working in the grocery stores, especially to get food and resources that we need just to kind of get by as human beings themselves, that we're able to do that. And it's very good in that you're always there with them. And it's a very tough situation that they're willing to put themselves out there, going, probably many days and on very few hours of rest. But we're thankful for them. And as they're working to try to find the best ways for resolution in all this, and whatever your plan is, and turning to you, God, we thank you for that. I thank you all for taking some time out of your schedule to spend with me to watch this video series, and I hope that God speaks to you through it, that he can reassure you, can comfort you, and you just know that whatever challenges you might be facing in life, in general, big picture, that he was always there. And in your son's name we pray, Lord. Amen. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon. Have a great day, great week. Bye.